From the outside, the conflict surrounding Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and Justin Baldoni once looked like just another Hollywood disagreement, a misunderstanding that would fade as quickly as it appeared. But the deeper the filings went, the more testimony surfaced, and the more recordings became public. A different story began to form. Not a story of retaliation, conspiracy, or coordinated attacks, but a story of timelines breaking apart, claims contradicting themselves, and evidence revealing something far more complicated than anyone expected. Behind closed doors, the case was shifting. What Blake believed would support her allegations instead raised new questions. A recording she insisted was key proof began to unravel her claims once the context was examined. Testimony she relied on introduced uncertainty rather than clarity, and documents she cited as evidence revealed interpretations that didn't match the reality they were meant to describe. At the same time, a second collapse unfolded, one driven by her own timeline. Events she said triggered retaliation did not precede the reactions she pointed to. Conversations she presented as harassment occurred long before she ever joined the project, and behaviors she framed as coordinated misconduct were never supported by the digital patterns she described. It was becoming clear that two narratives were clashing: the version Blake brought forward and the version shaped by the evidence now surfacing piece by piece. And as the contradictions grew, so did the pressure surrounding everyone involved. From Wayfarer Studios to the individuals swept into the storm, this was no longer simply a legal dispute. It had become a turning point for reputations, for careers, and for the truth itself. And the first real unraveling began long before anyone realized. The first sign that Blake's narrative was beginning to fracture didn't come from a filing or a press statement. It came from a recording she believed would strengthen her case. Instead, once the court reviewed it, the recording raised more questions than answers. The audio, submitted as part of Blake's evidence, was intended to support her claim that Wayfarer executives were involved in a coordinated effort to undermine her. But the moment the court examined it, the tone shifted dramatically. What sounded, in Blake's interpretation, like a calculated plan to spread damaging information appeared instead to be a frantic conversation about something far more mundane: cybersecurity concerns and delayed file delivery. There was no language suggesting a smear campaign, no indication of an orchestrated attack, no strategy for online retaliation. The individuals on the recording weren't discussing how to harm Blake's reputation. They were talking about how to retrieve and secure production materials that were late and potentially vulnerable. The urgency Blake perceived as malicious was simply the urgency of a studio managing its workflow under pressure. And this mattered because the recording had been positioned as one of the pillars of Blake's retaliation theory. But once the context became clear, the court saw a routine internal discussion, not a plot against her. Worse still, the recording highlighted a deeper issue. Blake's interpretation of events relied heavily on assuming intention where none was documented. Across multiple filings, she described actions as deliberate, targeted, or coordinated, yet the evidence repeatedly suggested otherwise. The recording only amplified that pattern. Behind the scenes, this misalignment between perception and reality was already influencing how her broader allegations were viewed. If the recording she believed would validate her claims instead undermined them, what did that mean for the rest of her narrative? As the judge noted the discrepancy, Blake's team pushed forward, insisting the recording still carried weight. But the courtroom was already shifting focus, because the next piece of testimony would not only challenge Blake's interpretation, but directly contradict one of her foundational claims. And the moment that testimony surfaced, the timeline Blake built around her allegations began to collapse in a way no one on her team expected. If the recording cast doubt on Blake's interpretation of events, the next revelation struck at something even more critical: her timeline. And once the court compared her allegations to the documented sequence of events,
the foundation of her story began to shift beneath her feet. A key element of Blake's claim centered on a conversation she described as inappropriate and deeply discomforting, one she argued played a role in the tension that followed. But during summary judgment proceedings, a detail emerged that her legal team hadn't anticipated. The conversation occurred before she ever agreed to work on the project.
This wasn't a minor correction. It rewrote the entire narrative she presented around motive, retaliation, and workplace dynamics. Blake had framed the discussion as something she endured because she was attached to the film, something she felt unable to escape, something that contributed to an atmosphere of discomfort and professional imbalance. But the evidence showed that the conversation took place during the early stages of communication, long before any contractual relationship existed. After hearing the timeline clearly, the court noted that Blake had full agency at that moment. She wasn't bound to Justin, his production, or the studio. She could have declined involvement. She could have stepped away. She could have chosen a different path entirely. Instead, she moved forward, collaborating, negotiating, and participating willingly in decisions and discussions related to the film. This revelation severely weakened her claim that she was pressured into a situation she felt unable to escape. The court recognized that if the conversation predated her involvement, it couldn't form the basis of a retaliation narrative. It wasn't a workplace interaction. It wasn't tied to power dynamics within the film. And most importantly, it didn't support the motives Blake attributed to Justin. The timeline didn't just crack, it split cleanly down the center. And the contradiction raised a deeper question. If one key event occurred differently than she described, what else in her narrative depended on assumptions rather than facts? Her team pressed on, but the court's focus had already begun to shift toward the next piece of evidence, a deposition that would expose even more inconsistencies in her account. Because the moment Justin's testimony was examined, the case took a turn that would further dismantle Blake's version of events. The timeline had already begun to unravel, but the most revealing shift came from Justin's own testimony. What he confirmed and what he corrected didn't just weaken Blake's claims, it exposed how far her narrative had stretched from the documented reality. During his deposition, Justin spoke directly about the events Blake had tied to discomfort, retaliation, and escalating hostility. One of Blake's central arguments was that she raised concerns about his behavior early on, and that this somehow initiated a pattern of mistreatment. But Justin's testimony pointed to a strikingly different sequence. He confirmed that the conversation Blake referenced, the very one she presented as proof of inappropriate conduct, was not only taken out of context, but occurred before she ever committed to the project. He explained that it was part of a broader creative discussion, not a personal judgment or targeted remark. And crucially, he emphasized that Blake had misrepresented the nature of the exchange in terms of both tone and timing. The court reviewed these statements carefully, and once again, the evidence aligned with Justin's account. But the deposition revealed something even more telling: Blake's own communications. In messages produced during discovery, Blake appeared enthusiastic, collaborative, and engaged. The tone stood in sharp contrast to the discomfort she later attributed to the same period. Instead of showing hesitation or distress, her words suggested excitement, a desire to participate, contribute, and build something alongside Justin and the team. This discrepancy became a major inflection point. If Blake had felt genuinely mistreated or pressured from the very beginning, nothing in her documented behavior reflected that. There was no withdrawal, no pushback, no sign she viewed the situation as harmful. Instead, the evidence showed proactive involvement, a reality that contradicted the narrative she constructed later. Justin's testimony didn't merely challenge one claim, it cast doubt on the framework of the entire lawsuit. Because if Blake willingly moved forward after the conversation she described as pivotal, then her argument for retaliation or coercion lacked the foundation the court required. And as the judge absorbed this contradiction, another fault line in Blake's story emerged, one tied not to testimony,
but to the internal dynamics she claimed fuels a coordinated campaign against her. That next revelation would not only challenge her assumptions, it would expose how misinterpreted internal conversations became the backbone of her accusations. If testimony had already chipped away at Blake's narrative, the next unraveling came from inside the very circle she relied on. Internal conversations, once seen as supporting her claims, revealed something far different when placed under legal scrutiny.
Blake's lawsuit framed several internal exchanges as proof that studio figures were conspiring against her. But when these conversations were examined in context, their meaning changed entirely. What Blake interpreted as evidence of a coordinated smear campaign turned out to be routine communication driven by stress, deadlines, and cybersecurity concerns, not personal animosity or targeted retaliation. One of the most telling examples came from a conversation involving members of Wayfarer's team. Blake claimed the exchange exposed a deliberate effort to damage her reputation, but when the actual audio and messages were reviewed, the content reflected logistical urgency, not malicious intent. The focus was on file delivery, system vulnerabilities, and production-related pressure, the kind of internal tension that naturally arises in fast-moving creative environments. This revelation echoed what Justin confirmed during his deposition. The narrative Blake constructed about a hostile internal environment didn't align with what the evidence showed. Even more damaging, individuals Blake believed would support her claims ended up revealing that much of the concern around online activity stemmed from assumptions, not data. Mistaken interpretations of unrelated public chatter were escalated into high-stakes accusations. And once those assumptions hardened into belief, they shaped the narrative Blake later presented in her lawsuit. But belief alone wasn't enough for the court. The judge noted that Blake's interpretation of internal discussions lacked the factual foundation needed to sustain claims of retaliation or coordinated wrongdoing. Instead of evidence, the record showed miscommunication and, in some cases, exaggeration that took on a life of its own as tensions rose. This pattern presented a serious problem for Blake's team. If the internal conversations were misread and the testimony contradicted her timeline, then what remained to support the core allegation that she had been targeted? As the court weighed this question, another contradiction surfaced, this one tied to the very digital activity Blake insisted was orchestrated against her. And when the data behind that online activity was finally revealed, it dismantled yet another pillar of her case. Blake argued that comments, posts, and online conversations were coordinated to pressure her and damage her standing in the industry. She described a rising pattern of negativity that aligned with what she believed was retaliation for raising concerns internally. But when the digital metrics were analyzed, the court found no evidence to support the existence of any such pattern, coordinated or otherwise. There were no unusual spikes in commentary, no clusters of behavior suggesting manipulation, no linkage between the online activity and the internal disputes she cited. Instead, the data revealed a simple truth. The discussions Blake pointed to were ordinary fluctuations, consistent with typical celebrity engagement, natural cycles of interest, trending moments, unrelated debates, and routine public opinion shifts, all of which had been interpreted through the lens of suspicion rather than through verified evidence. Even more telling, the posts Blake identified as harmful didn't originate from individuals tied to her timeline of conflict. They weren't synchronized. They weren't coordinated. They weren't responding to any private events. They were simply part of the public discourse that surrounds any high-profile figure. This undercut one of her core claims, that external voices were acting in concert with internal figures to retaliate against her. Without the digital component, her retaliation argument lost its momentum. And without motive, the narrative she built around escalating hostility weakened even further. But the court wasn't finished examining contradictions tied to the online narrative. Another layer remained, one involving the individuals Blake attempted to connect to the alleged smear effort. And when the judge weighed that part of her argument, the ruling revealed yet another setback.
because the court recognized that if digital manipulation couldn't be proven, then the attempt to tie external personalities to the dispute didn't just lack evidence, it raised questions about the integrity of the claim itself. And the judge's response to that attempt would further restrict Blake's ability to reshape her narrative. As Blake's claims about coordinated online hostility weakened, her legal team attempted a different approach, linking outside voices to the internal dispute she described. But the court's reaction revealed just how far the narrative had drifted from the evidence. Blake argued that certain commentators amplified the supposed retaliation against her, suggesting they were part of a broader effort to harm her reputation. In her filings, she implied that these individuals didn't just discuss the case, they contributed to a climate of hostility that intensified the pressure she faced behind the scenes. But when the court reviewed these allegations, the disconnect was unmistakable. There was no evidence connecting the commentators to Wayfarer Studios, to Justin, or to Ryan. No messages, no coordination, no involvement in any dispute Blake described. They were recognized as independent actors, individuals responding to public information, not participating in a private campaign. More importantly, the court reaffirmed that commentary about a public figure is protected, even when the figure disagrees with the interpretation. Unless Blake could demonstrate intentional wrongdoing or direct involvement from these commentators in her internal conflicts, their participation in public discussion was irrelevant to her legal claims. This ruling struck at the heart of her strategy. She had attempted to broaden the scope of responsibility, presenting a narrative that stretched from internal disagreements to external voices. But without evidence linking these worlds together, the foundation of her argument fractured yet again. In the judge's view, the attempt to implicate outside personalities did more to highlight weaknesses in her narrative than to strengthen it. It suggested a reliance on speculation, a willingness to interpret ordinary public discourse as targeted harm. This pattern mirrored the earlier contradictions: misreading internal conversations, misinterpreting digital activity, misrepresenting the timeline, misaligning motive with reality. Each ruling left Blake with fewer paths to reshape the narrative. The court had made it clear, only verifiable evidence would guide the case going forward. But just as the scope began to narrow, another contradiction surfaced, one tied not to commentators or testimony, but to Blake's own sequence of events, the very timeline she insisted supported her allegations. And when the court compared her timeline to the documented record, the gap between the two became impossible to ignore.
For weeks, Blake insisted that the sequence of events proved her claims, that the tension, the retaliation, and the hostility all followed a predictable path. But once the court placed her allegations alongside the actual timeline, the story she presented no longer matched the record she relied on. The turning point came when the court began comparing Blake's stated timeline to objective documentation. Emails, production schedules, text messages, internal memos, and digital timestamps. Almost immediately, inconsistencies emerged, not small ones, but shifts large enough to challenge the integrity of her narrative. Blake alleged that certain online discussions were triggered by internal disputes, but the posts she pointed to were dated before the conflicts she described. She claimed that hostility escalated after she raised concerns, yet the digital activity she cited showed no corresponding shift. She insisted certain interactions created an atmosphere of discomfort, but messages from the same period reflected enthusiasm, collaboration, and proactive involvement. Each contradiction created a ripple effect. If the online comments didn't follow the conflict, they couldn't be retaliatory. If the internal discomfort didn't precede withdrawals or objections, it couldn't support coercion. If the key conversation predated her engagement with the project, it couldn't be framed as workplace harassment. The court recognized a pattern forming. Blake's narrative wasn't just weakened by missing evidence, it was fundamentally misaligned with the factual sequence. Every major claim was tied to a timeline that didn't exist. Every allegation leaned on events happening in a different order than she described, and every attempt to correct these gaps only introduced new inconsistencies. In legal disputes, the timeline is often the backbone of a case.
Without a coherent sequence, motive dissolves, retaliation collapses, and the burden of proof becomes nearly impossible to meet. Blake's case was now approaching that threshold. As the court absorbed these contradictions, it became clear that her ability to reshape the narrative was narrowing rapidly. The judge had already limited speculative arguments, and the timeline discrepancies made it even harder for her legal team to justify the claims she brought forward. But the next revelation tightened the pressure even further, a contradiction involving evidence that Blake herself introduced, believing it would protect her position. Because when that evidence was examined closely, it didn't reinforce her narrative, it directly undermined it. If the timeline inconsistencies weakened Blake's credibility, the next development delivered an even harder blow, because it came from evidence she herself submitted. What was meant to strengthen her case ultimately exposed a contradiction she could not explain away. Among the documents Blake introduced was a set of messages and internal exchanges she claimed illustrated escalating tension and retaliatory behavior. She argued that these materials showed coordinated hostility, a subtle but deliberate shift in communication that mirrored the growing pressure she felt behind the scenes. But when the court reviewed the evidence, a different picture emerged. Instead of supporting her allegations, the messages showed routine collaboration, enthusiasm for the project, and a level of professional rapport inconsistent with the discomfort Blake later described. Her tone in these exchanges was warm, engaged, and proactive. She wasn't avoiding contact, she was initiating it. She wasn't expressing concern, she was expressing excitement. This raised a troubling contradiction. How could Blake claim she felt targeted, pressured, or retaliated against when her own communications revealed none of those signals? The court noted the discrepancy immediately. Communications submitted as proof of distress instead demonstrated confidence, creative alignment, and willingness to collaborate. They told a story of partnership, one that clashed sharply with the narrative Blake introduced after the relationship soured. But the contradiction didn't end with tone. It extended to timing. Messages she framed as reactions to alleged mistreatment were sent before the moments she claimed caused that distress. Exchanges she cited as evidence of escalating hostility reflected nothing of the sort. Instead, they showed planning, logistics, humor, and encouragement, suggesting a working dynamic that had not deteriorated the way she later alleged. This wasn't a minor detail. It was a structural contradiction impacting motive, credibility, and the entire retaliation narrative. If the evidence Blake submitted didn't support her claims, the court had little reason to accept the broader framework of her lawsuit. And while her team attempted to redirect focus, another problem was emerging, one tied to the individuals she accused and the legal standard required to prove their intent. Because the next legal hurdle Blake faced wasn't about evidence, it was about proving a motive that no longer aligned with any documented behavior. With the evidence contradicting Blake's claims and the timeline breaking apart, the court turned to the next critical question: motive. If retaliation had occurred, there had to be a reason. But the more the judge examined the record, the more one reality became unavoidable. Nothing about the documented behavior supported the motive Blake described. Blake insisted that internal frustrations, disagreements, and creative tensions escalated into a deliberate effort to undermine her. She argued that individuals within the project became angry when she raised concerns, and that this anger drove them to retaliate both internally and publicly. But when the court reviewed the communications from those same individuals, including executives, creative partners, and team members, no such hostility appeared. Instead, the record showed professionalism. Even in moments of stress, the conversations reflected practical problem solving, not resentment. The tone remained focused on production challenges, creative logistics, and unavoidable delays. None of it aligned with the idea of a group conspiring to damage her. Even more telling were the legal standards involved. To establish retaliation, she needed to demonstrate not just discomfort or disagreement, but intent. A clear decision by another party to act against her because of something she said or did. Intent requires evidence, and nothing in the record showed conversations, plans, or actions that suggested retaliatory motive. In fact, the messages showed the opposite. Justin and others repeatedly attempted to maintain a constructive working dynamic. They shared updates. They addressed concerns. They continued extending collaboration and goodwill. When conflicts appeared, they were handled through normal professional channels, not weaponized into personal attacks. This became a turning point for the court. Without evidence of motive, Blake's theory of retaliation lacked the foundation required to survive summary judgment. A legal claim cannot rest on interpretation alone. It must be supported by documented purpose, documented communication, and documented action, none of which existed here. Yet as this legal hurdle solidified, another contradictory thread emerged, one involving the escalating public narrative surrounding Blake and Ryan themselves, and the way emotional fallout began shaping the story far outside the courtroom. And when that public narrative collided with the legal reality, it exposed a final, unexpected crack in Blake's case, one that would reshape the entire outcome. As the legal contradictions mounted, the public narrative surrounding Blake and Ryan began shifting in a way neither of them anticipated. What started as a private dispute had grown into a cultural conversation, and that conversation was now colliding with the evidence in court, exposing a final fracture in Blake's case. Outside the courtroom, discussions surrounding the lawsuit intensified. Clips resurfaced, interviews were re-examined, and public sentiment began to tilt as more contradictions came to light. One moment in particular, a resurfaced clip involving Ryan's behavior toward colleagues, drew attention not because it proved wrongdoing in this case, but because it highlighted something larger, an increasingly strained public image. These moments didn't carry legal weight, but they influenced perception, and perception was becoming a problem for Blake's narrative. The public was no longer seeing a coordinated effort to harm her. They were seeing a pattern of misinterpretation, mixed messaging, and shifting accusations that did not align with the timeline unraveling in court. Inside the courtroom, the story was even clearer. The evidence Blake submitted contradicted her own claims. The testimony she relied on weakened key arguments. The digital activity she interpreted as targeted hostility proved organic. The individuals she attempted to implicate were uninvolved. And the conversation she framed as inappropriate occurred before any workplace relationship existed. And the timeline connecting everything simply did not exist. It became impossible to ignore. The legal foundation of her lawsuit had collapsed from every direction. Even the emotional dimension of the case, the stress, frustration, and growing tension Blake described, could not overcome the absence of motive, evidence, and chronological coherence. No matter how her narrative had evolved publicly, the legal structure required facts, and the facts did not support her claims. The opposing side recognized what the record now showed. This was not a case defined by retaliation, harassment, or coordinated malice. It was a case defined by misalignment between perception and evidence, between accusation, reality, and narrative and truth.
And as the final filings closed, the court faced a decision rooted not in emotion, but in the undeniable contradictions now surrounding Blake's allegations. What remained was only the question of how the judge would respond to a case that had unraveled from both ends, legally and publicly, leaving a story far different from the one Blake first brought forward. As the final documents settled into the record, the broader shape of the case became impossible to ignore. What began as a confident accusation had transformed into a story defined by shifting timelines, contradictory evidence, and testimony that dismantled the foundation Blake once believed was unshakable. Every key moment she pointed to, from the early conversation she misinterpreted, to the recording she believed suggested malicious intent, to the digital activity she framed as retaliatory, told a very different story when examined under the full weight of the evidence. The internal discussions she relied on reflected stress, not conspiracy. The online patterns she presented as targeted hostility proved indistinguishable from the normal rhythms of public attention, and her own communications revealed collaboration and enthusiasm, at times she later described as hostile or coercive. The court now faced the same reality everyone watching the case had begun to recognize. The narrative Blake constructed simply could not withstand scrutiny. Not legally, not factually, and increasingly not publicly. Yet the significance of this moment reached beyond the dispute itself. It became a reminder of how quickly perception can shift, how easily intentions can be misunderstood, and how crucial it is for allegations, especially those with industry-wide implications, to be grounded firmly in truth. As the judge prepares the next ruling, one thing is certain: the decision will not just close a chapter, it will determine how this entire story is remembered. For viewers following every twist and revelation in this unfolding legal drama, staying informed will matter more than ever. To keep up with every new development, viewers are encouraged to like this video and subscribe to the channel so they never miss the next update.